for part of the show. So thank you to David for putting this together. It's been really nice to see everybody interested and to learn about the connection that the Park Commission has had with the Boy Scouts for so long. You know, I'd known about the 10 Mile River Museum just sort of tangentially from my former boss, who was our sort of historian in the area, but didn't really know much about it. So it's been really cool to learn more about that history and to get to see it in the camps today. So just to thank you for coming out. I left a couple of my cards up here. If anyone is interested in coming back, wants to visit the archives, see more, send me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to show you around. Yeah, and with that, I'll turn it over to David and say thank you to Sue, who knows as much about these camps as maybe anyone, and probably more. So everything she says is going to be absolutely true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What kind of tree?
Thank you, Matt. I'd like to introduce Sue Scher. Sue Scher is a retired camper, counselor, camp director, social worker, community organizer, and college professor. She lives just outside the park, only a few miles from Carr Pond. It was while she was judging at the Harriman Group Camp Canoe Regatta that she realized the long history residential camps of social welfare organizations that existed in the park since 1913. Since then, she's been researching the history of these camps. Today's presentation about the Boy Scout camps is just one of several about this history. Welcome, Sue.
Thank you. I'm going to, hopefully this works. People back here can hear this. And right way. Welcome. I'm here today to talk to you about the Boy Scout camps in Harriman State Park, a massive installation of New York and New Jersey Boy Scout camps from 1913 to 1928-29. Now, in all honesty, I've never been a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout or a camper in any of the Harriman camps. My closest to Boy Scouts is my cousin Danny and our Uncle Bernie, who was a district commissioner in Brooklyn in the 40s and the 50s, in an area called Parkway. I don't know where that was. Was it Eastern Parkway or what Parkway? But that's my closest to Scouts. So the presentation today is coming to you from a Scout outsider. But I am an educator, a former camper and counselor and camp director, social worker who worked with children in groups, and a resident of Tuxedo, New York, right next to Harriman State Park. And I've spent the past 20 years researching the group camps that have been here since 1913. So it's because of that research that I was asked to make this presentation today. One of the reasons I wanted to do this presentation is that although there's a great deal of written information about the history of Boy Scouts in early books, other than the material in PIPC, Palisades Interstate Park Commission, and the 10 Mile River Boy Scout Museum, and David's books, there is almost nothing written about the Harriman Scout camps. It always surprised me that maybe one sentence in some of these books. And, you know, this was such a early and large installation. I was always amazed that there was never more written about it. And so, you know, I decided it was time to at least put together a presentation about it. So my information comes from the Commission's archives, and Matt mentioned the archives, which is a series of rooms upstairs in a building at Iona Island with boxes and boxes and boxes of material. From the files of 10 Mile River, Scout Museum, numerous books and articles, and websites and interviews that I've conducted. Now, we may have Twitter, email, and Facebook to help us communicate in these times. But in the times that I'm going to take you to, they had community newspapers in places like the Brooklyn Eagle, the Herald Tribune, and even the New York Times, where daily stories were written about people's lives and about Boy Scouts. There were whole pages in the Brooklyn Eagle each week that described all kinds of things about the Boy Scouts. And I found an amazing amount of stuff there that was very detailed, that really described what we did each day. And you know, this many kids left for that and they weighed this much, and when they came back they weighed this much, and this is the amount that they ate. And the Brooklyn Tuberculosis Society was really good about telling you how much each of their kids weighed from the beginning to the end. Well, that was the purpose of their camp. So I'm going to present the Boy Scout camps in a historical perspective of the times that led to them. And I may use several terms interchangeably, like PIPC and PIPC and commissioners, or Car Pond and Lake Stahaki, or Cedar Pond and Tiarati, Lake Kanowahke. There have been so many different spellings of the names. Now, you probably see, I was trying to be consistent in what I wrote to the spelling that is today, but it had O's and U's and stuff like that that don't have that. So, I'm not an expert in the Boy Scouts, and if there's something that I have said that is correct, or if you have information to add, I would like to know about it. So up there I have little green cards with my name so that you can be in touch with me and tell me, that was off, or hey, did you know about such and such? Because you never know. And one of the things that I like about presentations, and when I go to Doc Bain's presentations on Iona Island and Sterling Forest, I'm amazed at what the audience knows and what the audience adds to the knowledge. And that's how we grow, and that's how my presentation will get better. So get in touch with me if there's something to add or something that I need to say that's different. So first I'd like to know who's here today and have us get to know each other. So I have a few questions. I know that none of us went to the original Boy Scout camps in Harriman, where the oldest of us is too young for that. So, except maybe for the few who may have attended Spruce Pond. Anyone Spruce Pond?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good, okay. And it was not the early Spruce Ponds, but it was Spruce Pond. So, who here was a Boy Scout? Okay. A Girl Scout? Okay. Okay. Who went to a camp in Harriman State Park? Okay, we have a Quidnunk and a Tayada. Okay. Who went to a 10-mile river camp? Yay, okay. Who has ever been to the Red Apple Rest? Oh, wait. We at least have to drive you by there to see. It's not open now. Who has skated at either of the roller skating rinks in Harriman?
What?
The roller skating rinks. When the camps moved out, what were they going to do with that gigantic building? The park made it into a roller skating rink. And when it burnt down, they built the roller skating rink at Lake Sebago. So, anyway, okay, so one person's been there? Did someone say they were there?
Rings a bell, yeah.
Through Quidnung?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Who went to any camp? Any place? Any place, yeah, any place, okay. Okay, who knows who Uncle Benny was? Okay.
Just learned today.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, James West. Okay. Ernest Thompson Seton. Okay, you can see all the Boy Scout people. Dan Beard. Okay, yeah, lots of people have heard of. Who's heard of the Whiteboard trail system? Some people who are on the hike today may have learned about it. Okay. So by the end of my presentation, you will at least have been introduced to some of these. So the beginnings. Before we talk about 1913, when the Brooklyn Boy Scouts arose out of the shores of Colors Pond in Southfields, and before the Red Apple Rest was a glimmer in the eyes of Reuben Freed, We need to set the stage and go back to several beginnings in the late 19th and early 20th century. We'll go back to the beginnings of the summer camp movement, the Boy Scout movement, the Boy Scouts, and the Palisades Interstate Park. This is going to be a history lesson. Back to England and New York when they were becoming industrialized and urbanized. Now, resident camping is a uniquely American phenomenon, begun in the 1870s in the United States. The earliest camps were developed by teachers in boarding schools for boys of the rich who were bored and getting into trouble hanging around the Adirondack hotels and cottages. These grew out of concerns that rich boys in cities were not challenged enough and needed to gain more skills to survive in the changing environment of the times. As these private camps expanded in numbers and developed a model of activities, private girls' camps followed shortly. Organizational camps were started by the YMCA, and that's who Dudley was, primarily to serve, in the 1890s, primarily to serve middle-class boys whose parents could pay $5 to $7 a week. Fresh air country visits, and you've heard, people have heard of the Fresh Air Fund kind of thing, so these early days were fresh air visits to people whose houses took children out of the city and had them stay for a week or two during the summer. And later, fresh air residential camps, developed by religious and social agencies for the poor and immigrant children, were created because of the health and social welfare problems at the times. This is what the times were in the city then. Settlement houses first used country homes of their board members and then residential camping sites to expand their year-round programs. All of this is before the Palisades Park system began. So, okay, so how did the Palisades Park system begin? On Christmas Eve, 1900, Palisades Park system was created because the Carpenter brothers and other quarry businesses were blasting apart the face of the Palisades Cliffs in Fort Lee, New Jersey. And they were creeping further and further into the cliffs, into Englewood, and going north and south. It was very visible and very loud and dirty. Since 1980s, several groups had been working to save the park, to save the Palisades. They even got as far as an attempt to, a failed federal bill to make National Park a fort. Both New York and New Jersey officials and a very determined, organized group of New Jersey club women were concerned and began to work together. Ultimately, the states of New York and New Jersey created a private commission to purchase the Palisades. Most of the money came from private philanthropic people and some state and government money. The energy to save the Palisades came from the organization of the New Jersey Women's Clubs. Decisions of the land, used initially mostly in New Jersey, was to be overseen by a private interstate commission, the Palisades Interstate Park Commission, and not for the government to administer. George Perkins was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, then governor of New York, to pull all this together. And he had amazing money contacts, including J.P. Morgan, who he worked for. He was called J.P. Morgan's left-hand man. At the time of the first purchase, there was not much thought about how they were going to use the land, other than to preserve the scenery and stop the noise and the dirt. So on Christmas Eve, 1900, the blasting stopped, and for the next 6 years, the commissioners of this public private interstate partnership, worked to buy the land along the Hudson River, it was further down at the bottom of the Hudson, from Fort Lee to the New York border. Shortly after the blasting stopped, an interesting phenomenon happened. People from New York and New Jersey saw open land along the river and asked the commissioners if they could use it for recreation. Commissioners, not knowing what else to do with it, said, okay. And this was the beginning of thousands of people in canoes paddling over, and large families, and camping for free for up to a month, and ferries bringing families and large groups of people for day outings. So people found the park, for which the commission then began to provide docks, beaches, campgrounds, and dancing pavilions. How many of you as kids spent any time there in Jersey? Yeah, I mean, there were all kinds of services down there. Among the groups that were using the shores of the Palisades for recreation were settlement houses and charity organizations providing fresh air trips. They put them on barges coming out of Brooklyn and come up the Hudson to these pavilions. These groups began asking for more permanent sites, which was not available along the narrow strip of land along the Hudson River. But a larger piece of land did become available in 1910. Who this morning asked about when Harriman? Okay. This parcel of land came from E.H. Harriman, who was a railroad tycoon who for about 30 years owned large tracts of land just north of Tuxedo in the Ramapo Mountains. Shortly after his death in 1909, his wife, Mary Harriman, turned over 10,000 acres and $1 million to the state and Pepsi to create a new park. This donation had conditions, though, which included the state-owned Bear Mountain. Okay? And Sing Sing Prison was getting too big, and they decided to either move Sing Sing Prison or build another site at Bear Mountain. And that didn't fit too well with the Harrimans, whose land sort of backed onto the whole thing. So the conditions was that the state discontinue building the prison at Bear Mountain, and that the money be matched by state and private donations to be used to purchase additional lands to develop a contiguous park between Bear Mountain, which was on the east side, and the Harriman land, which was way over on Route 17 on the west side. This was the beginning of Bear Mountain and Harriman State Parks. And so for the next decade, the commissioners continued to add to this land, either with money from the Harriman's donations or state money or other private donations. For the past 110 years, the commission has continued to expand. So today, the Palisades Interstate Park consists of 20 parks, 9 sites, mostly historical sites, and 130,000 and growing acres. Prior to its use as a park, the land had served a variety of purposes. Most of the land owned by the Harriman was filled with the remains of iron ore mines, exploratory pits, and blast furnaces. You may see the remains of the iron industry throughout the park. It was denuded of trees and animals. Blast furnaces, which are needed to roast the ore to eliminate the impurities, need charcoal, and charcoal needed trees. Have any of you read and followed Ed Lennox's book on the iron ore trails and hikes in the park? Okay, because he really spent a lot of time exploring all the mines and wrote a book that told us about hikes that you could take to go. So some of the lakes in the park were created for the mines. Few of them were natural, but they were small. The land contiguous to the Harriman holdings had also been used by families for subsistence farming as well as the iron ore mining. Villages such as Johnsontown, Sandyfield, Pine Meadow, Laydentown, Doodletown, Baileytown were filled with homes of people who were either miners or farmers. Their homes were brought up and destroyed to make the park. Remains of some of the towns are found under several of the lakes and in the woods. With the addition of the Harriman 10,000 acres, the commissioners had the ability to expand their work of conserving land and providing mass recreation. They began here at Bear Mountain because it was accessible via the river. The surrounding area, the surrounding Highland Lake, which we now call Hessian Lake, became the early focus of massive recreational activity. Bear Mountain offered opportunities for swimming, camping, and hiking to people with very limited means. George Perkins really went out of his way to make sure that the facilities were available for people with limited means. They bought steamboats because the existing private steamboat companies were charging too much for people to get there. So he bought steamboats that they could pay very little for middle class and working class people to come up. So, the Boy Scouts didn't arise out of nowhere. It was a highly organized, popular effort and the end of a chain of many organizations created to respond to the needs of children and adults as society around them was changing during the 19th century. The work on behalf of, and here's my social work, of boys was an effort called by many as the Boyce movement, or also called the character building times. For these roots, we need to look at what was happening in England and the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Life was changing for the middle class and the poor. In England and the United States, we were becoming highly industrialized. In the United States, massive immigration was taking place. For jobs, people were moving from farms to cities, far away from family structures and religious roots. Leisure was increasing for children and adults. People were concerned about what was happening to the health and character and soul of young men and boys. Efforts were different on behalf of middle-class boys from working-class boys, but the focus was on boys. The Boy Scout movement comes out of the attempts to save the middle-class boys. To serve these boys, the Young Men's Christian Organization, the YMCA, established in London, England in 1844, was developed to meet the needs of newly urbanized Christian young men living alone. The focus was on character and intellectual building and maintaining their original roots. These Ys provided housing, athletics and sport training, libraries and intellectual and religious study, things they would have gotten if they had stayed home. Activities were based on small groups called clubs. Another of these groups, the Boys Brigade, was established in 1883 to develop Christian manliness by the use of semi-military discipline and order, gymnastics, summer camps, and religious services and classes. I know this is going on, but this is the roots of Boy Scouts. This is what Boy Scouts arose out of and why it's important. Programs were church-based. The Y concept was transported to the United States in 1850 in order to serve similar populations. In 1851, the first YMCA began in Boston. By 1885, the Y began experimenting with camping and residential camping. Camp Baldhead. It's called Baldhead because everybody had to shave their heads to come to camp. I don't think it was because of any health thing. I don't know if there was any, health problem going on there. It was later called Dudley. Camp Dudley was the first Y camp. Efforts on behalf of working class boys also came from England in the 1870s. he saw the development of the Boys Club, organized by university clubs and schools to meet the health and recreational needs of poor boys. It's interesting, as different from the Ys, which focused on meeting the needs in clubs, the Boys Club, working with working class kids, had much more massive programming rather than the small groups around certain interests. So using a slightly different model of service, the 1880s saw the beginning of the settlement house movement with the opening of Toynbee Hall in London. And here's where middle-class men and women concerned with meeting the needs of poor in a particular community bought a house and moved in. They settled in. That's where the word settlement comes from. They settled in, lived there, and provided services. So within a few years, all of these programs gravitated to the United States. In 1861, saw the first Boys Club in Hartford, Connecticut. In New York City, E.H. Harriman created the 1876 Tompkins Square Boys Club to get the boys off the streets and teach them manners. Their first summer camp began in 1903. In 1886, the university settlement in New York, and 1889, Hull House, Jane Addams, were created. And by 1900, there were more than 100 settlement houses in the United States. So what else or who else came from England? Who's this? We know him. Robert Benton Powell, who attempted to translate his success with training troops in the military to adolescent men and boys, who he felt were not physically or spiritually fit. And as a soldier in India and Africa, he excelled in training young soldiers. And when he returned from the wars, he was asked to use those skills to train young boys who were members of the Boys Brigade. Now, that's one of the boys' movement organizations whose original program involved a lot of drilling, which bored the boys. But it seems it didn't bore the teachers. They had begun to use manuals that Baden Powell had used for soldiers. They started using them in the Boys Brigade. And so in 1907, Baden Powell modified his Army training manuals to suit boys, and having been influenced by Ernest Thompson Seton, added nature and outdoor concepts. But he decided to leave the Boys Brigade when he found that the adult leaders still preferred drilling. And he developed his own program, the Boy Scouts, in 1908. As with his Army soldiers, he developed a model of working in small groups, with a boy leading a patrol, which combined to form larger adult-led troops. Sound familiar? As Baden Powell was good at telling stories, the campfires were an integral part of the program. He expanded his manual, focused on the needs of boys. English Scouts made promises to honor, to be prepared, and if you say be prepared, as B-P, the Baden Powell. Okay. These activities were chosen to help character building and skill development, skills to help one survive in the out of doors and in the new cities. They had 3 levels of membership: tenderfoot, second class, first class, with tests required to move from one level to the next. You wonder where we came from? So how did the Boy Scouts get to the United States? Well, there was this, Baden Powell was not working in isolation. There was a two-way communication between Baden Powell, the people from the Y movement, and other groups in the United States, part of the boys movement influencing each other. One of the stories we hear is about William Boyce, a Midwest newspaper publisher, an entrepreneur on a trip to London, England. He got lost in the fog, and out of the fog came boy who helped him. When Mr. Boyce tried to tip the boy and thank him, the boy refused, saying that he was only doing his scouting good deed. This impressed Mr. Boyd, who returned to the United States to help establish the Boy Scouts of America. In fact, he was influential in helping the Boy Scouts of America get a federal charter. Well, two of the greatest influences on the Boy Scout movement in the United States, as it was being developed, were Ernest Thompson Seton and Daniel Beard. Seton was a naturalist, illustrator, and a writer of animal stories. In 1902, there were a bunch of boys who were messing up on his property in Connecticut, and he invited these boys to camp at his estate as a means to prevent their antisocial behaviors. And so he started telling them stories and camping with them, and developed an experience that immersed them in nature, the wilds and woodcraft. And because he believed that Native Americans lived in harmony with nature, he encouraged imitating their behavior with Native ceremonials. His program, too, involved ranks and awards for achievement. He, too, developed manuals to teach skills. He, too, worked with youth in small groups, with the patrols taking animals and native names. Both Baden-Powell in England and the Wives incorporated many of his ideas. He published stories about his work in periodicals of the times, which gathered national attention. Now, Daniel Carter Beard focused on the natural environment in a different way. He identified with the pioneers who settled in the United States. He was an engineer, an artist, and a surveyor. As an illustrator and freelance writer in the 1880s, he wrote guides to the out of doors, the American Boy's Handybook, for example. He too was concerned about the health of city boys and encouraged those in the boys movement towards a nature orientation. His model was not the Native American, though, but the American pioneer. And in 1905, he established Sons of Daniel Boone, the unit of work named after pioneers such as Kit Carson, Davy Crockett, were 4 stockades of 8 boys, each which made up a fort, the patrol to the troop. So he had stockades and forts, and the fort leader was Daniel Boone. So both Seton and Baird, because of their focus on the natural environment, worked together initially, but we later see them battle as the differences in their way of approaching nature played out in their attempts to influence the Boy Scouts. So now, in 1909, we have Baden-Powell, William Boyce, the organizational structure of the YMCA, and the naturalists coming together to try to create healthier boys. Their aims were similar, but their methods different. I think of it as the fight for the soul and the structure of the United States Boy Scout organization. We see that there had been a lot of different organizations attempting to reach both the poor and middle class boys, but none captured the attention, as did the Boy Scouts. While the nature orientation attracted the boys and the scoutmasters, the technical organizational skills of the YMCA men took Baden-Powell's concepts, Seton and Baird's nature orientation, and developed it into an American institution. By 1910, the Scouts of America received a charter to incorporate. It was at this initial stage of implementation that the skirmishes occurred. In the long run, it was the YMCA staff under James West, an attorney who worked for the Y, that developed a national organizational structure, which involved paid rather than volunteer staff. It was Seton's woodcraft and Native American focus that won over Daniel Beard's pioneer focus on programming. The Boy Scouts of America developed into a national, centralized organization with strong controls over the local council. Scout troops themselves was to be sponsored by organizations. They weren't freestanding, such as churches, Ys, and other groups. This combination enabled the organization to quickly develop its manuals and rules and massive publicity, but also to reach boys all over the country. It caught on very quickly. Newspaper articles and books for boys such as Tom Slade Boy Scout helped public relations. By 1911, just 1 year after the charter, West and Seton had created the new handbook with a highly developed program, including a hierarchy of ranks, 57 merit badges, with camping as an integral part of the program. Although underlying the U.S. version of the Boy Scouts was a somewhat military orientation, it was not to the extent that was found in England. Seton and Baird's influences were strong, and they did not come out of a military experience. So, we have the Boy Scouts, and we have a lot of boys in New York City, and a lot of boys who are Boy Scouts in New York City. Where did these New York City Scouts and Scoutmasters go to camp? Well, as early as 1911, the New York City Boy Scouts organization formally approached the park. I remember it was 1910 that they first got the land here. So 1911, they're saying, we want to come here. We want to camp here. And so they approached the park for campsites for their outdoor program. We see signs in annual reports that 1911 and 1912, the Boy Scout troops from out of New York City were camping along with everybody else in the sites in Bear Mountain. They built tent platforms and they had informal sites for people to camp up in Bear Mountain. But the Scouts were looking for land that was more rustic and for themselves, not along with everybody else and every other organization in New York. And although the section at Bear Mountain was accessible via the river, the interior and the western sections, at least to city people, were considered the wilderness and challenging to reach. I don't know, the town of Tuxedo was over there. I don't know why it was so challenging to reach, but if you were going from Bear Mountain, it was really rustic, getting down the 20 miles. So in 1913, the Commission Park began building a road to open up the areas between Bear Mountain and Route 17 in Southfields. It was opened in 1915 and called the Bear Mountain Southfields Road. It happened to have had a lot of names. It was also something Greenwood Lake, Haverstraw Road, and Route 46. But by then they'd begun expanding small ponds into larger lakes or created new lakes, and the road passed 7 of the lakes. Now the road was renamed 7 Lakes Drive. It's not the 7 Lakes Drive you know today, because it came down from Bear Mountain and then came to the Kanowahke Circle. Okay. Went around the Kanowahke Circle and didn't go straight, it hooked right. And to the west, and exited at Route 17 in Southfields at a train station. Not where it exited. It then later shifted the road to Wildcat. And this is intersection of 17 and 17A, when they built the Wildcat Bridge that allowed 7 Lakes Drive to get out at 17 right there. It wasn't until 1960 that 7 Lakes Drive was reroaded and goes down to Sloatsburg. So, on this wilderness, it was the Brooklyn Scouts who were the first group to move onto the more remote areas in Harriman Park to Carr Pond. And some write it C-A-R and some write it C-A-R-R. And I've tried exploring why it's called Carr Pond, and all I can find, it was the first person to build a house there, and that's all I can find out about why it was named Carr Pond, which we now know as Lake Stahopee. It appears the park was initially going to Cedar Pond, but at Lake Tirati, but for some reason, at the last minute, they seem to move them to Carr Pond, and I don't know why. So how did they get to Carr Pond? How did they get to camp there? Well, there were two main ways. Oh, and I have to tell you, up here on the shelf are several binders. The first four binders are a series of the park pictures, many of which you'll see today, but you can see that. We also have, there's something in that green binder that some person, I have the name there, that I found, and I think David found in the files, that was a series of 20 cartoons that I just absolutely love, because it's a trip to camp from the Bronx Boy Scouts, and it starts in the city, and it works to taking the subway, leaving your house, taking the subway, just all the steps until they got to camp, sleeping overnight, doing some activities, and then getting ready to go home. Wonderful. I think we have to figure out a way to do something about that, because I think it's wonderful. Anyway, I did find one newspaper article that described the Scouts hiking through Brooklyn from their homes to the ferry in Brooklyn that, before the Verrazano Bridge, that took them across to Hoboken. And once in Hoboken, they got on the Weary Erie, the Erie Railroad, what the kids called the Weary Erie. And they took that to that train station in Southfield, and then usually hiked the couple of miles over to Carr Pond. So, or they could get to Manhattan, take the ferry to Manhattan and get on one of the large steamers, like the Claremont or the Hollander, that went up the Hudson River to Bear Mountain. At that point, they either hiked the 15 miles down from the ferry, okay, or were driven in one of the park's omnibuses. This was not the hour trip from New York City that it is today. This was like a day trip. At that point, Carr Pond was 17 acres. But as the park moved in the Brooklyn Scouts, which was called, the camp was called Camp Leeming, it recognized an interest in formal long-term organizational camping, in addition to individual short-term camping. The park expanded the lake several times, first to 45 and then to the present size of 88 acres, by building 3 dams. If you're boating on the lake, you can see some of these dams, you remember seeing that? Shaking your head. You can see the dams in there. They had to expand the lake. They kept putting more camps there. So when you see the early pictures of Carr Pond, you see small islands and floating limbs. Carr Pond Kanowahke doesn't look like that now. But they had to flood the swampy shores and raise the lake level. They had 80 men working on this. The commission has built an ice house, a log cabin, a drinking water system, 75 tent platforms, a playground, crib and docks for swimming and boating. A pipe was laid from a spring 2,000 feet up the valley to the mess hall with several small branches to the camps. PIPC doesn't do anything halfway. In a 1913 report, they said, the commissioners have under consideration plans for making and enlarging other lakes throughout this section. And they certainly did do that throughout the park. Carr Pond was one of 14 natural lakes. The rest of the 22 were man-made. The original lakes had been named after people or natural features. In 1912, when the park began building lakes for the recreation programs, they were first given numbers. Then they were given Indian names by Camille Welch, the wife of the park engineer, Major William Welch. She consulted the Museum of the American Indian and a 1983 book, Indian Names in New York, and decided on names that were reflective of the Mohegan language. So we have Car Pond became Stahahi, which is stones in the water. Cedar Lake and Cedar Pond were two lakes that were part of the iron ore. And, Tiarati, blue like the sky. Little Long Pond, Kanowahke, place of much water. Ascati, this side, and Winrod, and Sconanti is on the other side. Cohasset, place of the pines. The park names each of the sections of camps after the lake that surrounded them. K for Kanowahke, S for Stahahi, T for Tiarati. People who were at the tour this morning saw, K1, K2, K3. So each individual camp was given a number. That way, although organizations came and went from the park or moved from one lake to the next, the park could identify a specific site of theirs. So at Lake Kanowahke, they had K1 through K33, even though each camp had its own name. At Carr Pond, the park began developing more infrastructure. The Palisades Commission has built an extensive pavilion which served for dining room and indoor activities. At this first camp, Camp Leeming, was not, my first thought, okay, 1913, they moved in there, they came with a bunch of Boy Scouts and their patrols, and they just were there. They were a very organized camp. It was not informal patrols and troops, just overnight camp. They arrived with a full program. Staff included a scoutmaster, physician, and cooks. Food cost $3.50 per week, 75 tents on 10 floors, 350 boys at a time, all for 2 weeks. Boating and swimming and forestry, signaling, swimming, overnight hikes of several days, nightly council fires with lectures, 5,000 boys for the summer. Scouts attended camp with their patrols or their troops. A wireless radio was available in the camp for communication. Parents could come and visit, and even stay over. There are newspaper articles, Monroe newspaper articles, which seem to show informal contacts between the boys and the neighboring communities, depicted in softball games and trips to local scouts. Here, this is more articles like the Brooklyn Eagle or the Monroe newspaper telling, the Boy Scouts came and we played them, and the Southfields group played them. In 1915, 2 more council camps arrived at Lake Stahahi, Camps Ramapo and Midwelt. By 1916, Richmond Borough Scout Council and some New Jersey Boy Scouts were there at Carr Pond. But at this point, several Carr Pond camps, the Brooklyn camps, moved to one of the Kanowahke lakes while the park was in the process of damming Kanowahke. The commissioners claimed that the Boy Scout camps were helpful to them in their forestry and patrol programs, patrolling the roads. So more and more Boy Scouts and councils wanted their own sites, as did other religious and charity organizations. So in 1916, the Association for the Improvement of the Conditions of the Poor brought 428 unnourished boys to Carr Pond to enjoy the benefits of fresh air and healthy food and medical care as a nutritional experiment camp. So, what to do with all these Boy Scouts and other organizations wanting camps? Well, camps have to have lakes, and the park did not have that many natural lakes. So how did the commissioners deal with this onslaught? They built more lakes. Now back east from Carr Pond, where we were today at Kanowahke, in the area that was once a village called Johnsontown, was Little Long Pond, Stony Creek, Stony Brook, Stillwater Creek, and a big swampy area. Under the management of Major Welch, the chief engineer, since 1912, the park created 3 lakes, or a chain of 3 lakes. They called it the Kanowahke Chain of Lakes. And although Little Long Pond still had its identity in that way, the campers called them Lake 1, Lake 2, Lake 3. Spring Pond, which was close by, was developed into the water source for the lakes. By 1917, the lakes and the infrastructure was built to move the Boy Scouts out of Carr Pond and into the largest Boy Scout camp installation in the country, at the Kanowahke Lakes, where they remained until 1928 and 29. The scout camps encircled these 3 lakes. Small tunnels enabled the scouts to get from one lake to the next. The beauty of these lakes led to the composition of this song, sung at pageants. I have no idea what the tune is, so I'm not going to sing it for you, but you can see round the shores of Kanowahke, camps encircling lie.
Like John Pritchard would have done.
And you know, while
They adapted it for Rock Lake.
Oh, really?
The exact song. The exact song.
Well, you know, one of the things, and maybe it was David who had said to me that as the scouts left Kanowahke and moved to Darrowsburg, they picked up their camp and their scouts and moved it and plopped it down there. So that the original scouts at Tyndall River was really a replication of, well, it makes sense. Because they didn't have a lot of time to restructure everything. So each borough council maintained a separate camp in charge of its own camp director, acting for the local camp committee. So each council had a camp committee, and so planning their own programs, vests, and discipline. There was, though, a central administration overseeing of the Boy Scout camps in the park. Chief camp director was the administrative head. Chief quartermaster purchased and distributed supplies. Director of activities assisted camps with activities and arranged intercamp and religious activities. Camp physician was responsible for sanitary and health conditions. This, if you look at it close, and I think I have the copy of that in there so you can see how administratively oriented this was. It's no little fly-by-night stuff.
Were they paid?
Yeah. Yeah, this was paid staff. That was one of the things that kind of differed from England's Boy Scouts volunteer or laissez-faire. The model was the Y. And the Y was very administratively, bureaucratically structured and paid staff. So they did a lot of fundraising and they got a lot of money now. So the National Boy Scouts, which had a camp committee, provided oversight and over the years played an increasing role over that of local councils. The majority of the camps at Lake Kanowahke were from New York City Boy Scouts councils, including Brooklyn, Manhattan, Bronx, Richmond, and Queens. And with councils from New Jersey, Long Island, Westchester, also camping there. So this is, if you want to look at the names of the camp, one of the little book over there, you can see the list of all the camps that were at Lake Kanowahke. The Manhattan Borough Council had Camp Spencer, Seneca, Onondaga, Cayuga, Mohawk, Oneida. Brooklyn camps included Leeming, Cropsey, Kennevet, Burton, Midwood, Hiawatha, and Murphy. Bronx camps included Laughing Waters and, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, Ranaqua, and Inaqua. Okay. Queens camps, Matunic. And Staten Island had the big A word, which I can't pronounce.
Aquahanga.
And Richmond.
Aquahanga.
Aquahanga, okay. No Native American influence here, huh? not to be undone by the New York City Council's Yonkers, Passaic, Watchung, Five Towns, Bayonne and Perth Amboy, Dutchess, North Hudson, Westchester, Orange County, Morristown, Lone Star Groups, Sea Scouts, Rover Camps. I had never heard, I had to call David about Rover Camps. Carstead and Newark all had camps. Because the reservation had a large centralized administration, they needed their own facilities. At the center was the central headquarters called Tahlequah. Okay. Some days I can pronounce it. It was a large and flat site. We saw that today, how flat it was. Okay. With a building able to accommodate large-scale programming. This was so large that after the Boy Scouts moved out, it became a roller skating rink where people from all over the park and local communities came to skate. Ask a present old-time camper or a tuxedo resident. Today it's the site of the Nature Museum and a parking lot. Near this site was a large stone community building where indoor activities could be held, as well as Protestant and Catholic church services. Now, most of us in the camping world think about camp counselors as 8 to 22-year-olds with, maybe some director as the older staff. Well, the Kanowahke chain of camp staff were adults, either volunteer scoutmasters or adult men administrators who were called officers. What did they do with their families when they came to camp for 5 two-week sessions? Well, there was a camp for the officers. Families operated by the general camp, Camp Wanasquetta, which means top of the hill. Initially it was on Little Long Pond, on land with some established homes that were not part of the Harriman donation, but in 1915 they started purchasing, it was part of Johnsontown, and they started purchasing these houses, or this property. And so there are 2 family camps there right now. But the family Boy Scout camp started there. But the camp moved around to K-13, K-16, or 17. Lots of camps moved around. I call it, these camps slept around all over the park. Moved from up there and down and back. The camp could hold 75 people for a week. It cost $14 for an adult. Families slept in tents. Meals were in the dining hall. We called the mess. Scouts were not allowed to visit. The camps conducted their own program. Now, some of the camps were what we called general camps, general camping camps, but some specialized. So we've heard talk of Spruce Pond, which was not on Lake Kanowahke, but was about 8 miles, from Kanowahke, it would have been about 8 miles down the Seven Lakes Drive, but at Wildcat Mountain on Spruce Pond, at its Rock Oak Forestry Camp program, or the Roosevelt
Conservation camp.
Roosevelt Restoration Camp? Conservation camp, okay. The other scouts stayed for 1 month, not 2 weeks like the rest of the scouts, learned pioneer activities, and ran the campsites by themselves. And this is one of the scouts built this bridge for a Museum of Natural History, had an insect station research camp just down the road from where they were, and created the first marked nature trail in the country. And they built this bridge for them because it went over Wildcat Creek. And so it was the Spruce Pond kids who built that. Now at K2, we found the Sea Scout Island Camp at islands off the lakeshore. And they too had, they are on the islands in Kanowahke. Remember, again, this was a lake that was filled in, that still had, floating islands and all kinds of stuff in the middle, because it was the early days of them flooding the swamps. So they too had bridges, which took them from the islands to the shore of the lake. It's interesting, this camp had a grounded ship called the Seagull with a mast and rigging for them to learn on. And the scouts who became proficient could go for a 2-week cruise on the Connecticut River. Yeah. There was another thing about some trip to the Midwest on a big lake that if you became even more proficient that you could do. I'm not sure it was necessarily for the Kanowahke Sea Scouts, but for Sea Scouts in general. So there was a very big Sea Scout movement. So the camps were spread around 31 sites, and the roads weren't so great. It was easier for them to reach each other and to receive supplies via the lakes. So there were a variety of boats that were used to access. And so now what the park did is they were building so many camps that they started standardizing it. It was, this is what we're doing, and you pick up and move. So they built camps for 50 kids, for 50 people, composed of waterproof nests made out of the chestnut logs, a fireplace with a kitchen, a water, with built-in water, a storeroom, a refrigerator. Now the Boy Scout camps had cooks. Not all the other camps didn't. Other camps, food was cooked up at Bear Mountain and trucked down to the camps. But the Boy Scouts had such a large installation. They had cooks. They had partially enclosed wash cabins with running cold water. We saw the wash cabins today. 6 to 10 faucets. Now, Tuxedo and Sloatsburg, which were the nearest towns, were not very accessible, nor did they have food markets. And to be honest, they don't have food markets today. So getting foods and produce to all of the camps, remember by 1925 there were 50 camps. Only half of them Boy Scouts. How do you get food to all these people? The park started purchasing food in bulk. And they stockpiled, and they delivered them to the camps. There was a steamer that came from Newburgh to Bear Mountain, bringing food from the markets up in Newburgh to the stockpile. Well, it was not only the camps, because they had thousands of people here at Bear Mountain coming to eat. They had 3 restaurants. They had restaurants for different levels of income. You know, not like now, but fancy restaurants to restaurants for poor people. The steamer came down several times a week with food for the camps. The camps had a toilet system, a water closet was built in a separate building, water systems were inspected by the New York State Health Department. Sleeping facilities were mostly on wooden platforms with canvas tents. And here we can see some of the different kind. Now, often the tents were lined up in avenue style. I don't know, I guess they used Manhattan and had to put their tents all on top of each other. Where there were cabins, they were cabins to hold 8 and some to hold 16 people. So we need to stop and talk a little bit about diversity in the Kanowahke camps. In the early days, all of the camps in Harriman were segregated by gender and by race, and in many ways by religion, because New York and New Jersey scout troops and camps were sponsored by community-oriented organizations, which were segregated because their communities were segregated. We don't see gender and racial-oriented integrated camps until the 1940s, and then, interestingly enough, Gordon Parks, a well-known photographer, did a whole series of pictures on racially integrated camps in a number of parks a number of camps, and most of them were camps in Harriman. But this was in the 40s. You know, the YMCA, which was the major force in the development of Boy Scouts, began with a white Protestant Christian orientation. In 1916, Declaration of Religious Principles, the Boy Scouts of America developed a policy against religious discrimination. And that was pretty important for New York camps, the New York Boy Scouts, which is a very diverse city as compared to some other cities in the Midwest. We find proof of this religious diversity in camp brochures of the borough councils, which stress religious services for Protestant, Catholic, and Jews, each with their own ministers and rabbis. We also found mention of either a kosher mess, kosher dining room, or a kosher camp for Jewish boys, but I haven't found any specific information, so if anybody knows that, possibly. I've seen 3 different names of camp, something with a D or Camp Kanowahke, don't know for sure. But Brooklyn and the Bronx were among the most diverse communities in the country, so the Harriman camps had to have that kind of diversity. As I and David reviewed hundreds of photos and brochures of Harriman Camp Boy Scouts, we found no pictures of Black Scouts. The time frame we are discussing here was before at the very beginning of the Great Migration, which brought millions of Black families from the South to all parts of the country. So while today 20% of New York is Black, or New York City is Black, in 1910 it was 2%. There were Black YMCAs in New York, and the Carlton Y, Brooklyn among the first. And this Y did have a Boy Scout troop, Troop 55, which began in 1911, amongst the first Black troops in the country. There is oral history that indicates boys from this troop attended camp in Harriman, most likely Camp Leaman. This picture from the files of the Carlton Y appears to be in the 20s, before 10 Mile River was created. So we are assuming it was at Harriman, but don't know for sure.
But
So,
it's important that our own Paul Lumpkin's grandfather
right.
attended the Carlton Y and started his scouting there.
An indication that he was, I did finally find an article that said after he was with the Boy Scouts on this troop, he then went up to Lake Kanowahke for the remainder of the summer or something like that. So that's what makes me feel like we could say, kind of like it might be. Right. So, what did the Scouts do during the day and the evening? Camps functioned on a schedule with a bugle to help them know when and where to be. The day began with reveille and ended with taps. And here's an example of what their day looked like. Tent cleanliness, I guess hospital corners on beds were important each day. And I'm going to quickly go through pictures of activities so you can see the wide range. The Scouts were able to use their time in camp to work on skill development, recreation, for advancement in rank, and for merit badges. This is fire building. This is gathering the water. This is relaxing and reading, because there was a rest hour. Every camp in the world had a rest hour. Going places. Nodding.
Not tired.
Not tired, yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm gonna see this. This is tracking stars. First aid. Boating and getting out there on the rock. The barbershop. Learning to start fires. I don't know what they were building and making here, but they learned how to do construction. Fire building. Singing, I don't know that the Boy Scouts sang as much as the Girl Scouts did, but I do have this booklet of words of Boy Scout songs. This was getting letters from home, mail time.
What are all these caps?
You know, yeah, they had all kinds of beanies.
These were
David, maybe some year you can do, in addition to emblems, do what hats they all wore?
Well, the 10 Hour Scout Museum issued a guide to memorabilia 10 Hour Scout camps, and that has a whole page on beanies.
Oh, okay, we'll have to look at that. You think they transported the beanies from Kanowahke?
They were fairly lightweight. I'm sure they were easy enough to.
I don't remember beanies. I don't remember beanies.
Well, I know, yeah, but you weren't there in 1930.
But I wasn't.
You weren't there in 1930, so. Oh, so waterfront activities, you'll notice a focus on swimming and boating with required daily swim instruction, twice daily recreational swimming. Waterfront swimming and boating were integral. Rowboating and canoeing was not only recreational, but a necessity, because early on there were few roads and the roads were lousy. And the lake was how goods were delivered to individual camps and how campers moved between camps. Frequently, I mean, you just look at the lakes, you look at all the stuff in the lakes, and you look at the lakes now, and you know, there are a few islands, but not all these little islands. Frequently, the camps at the lake, this is swim instruction in the cribs. Who was wanting asking about a war canoe? Yeah.
This is that's good.
Oh, okay.
Can I say something about swimming?
Sure.
So Daniel Carter Beard actually wrote a book about life-saving awards that were given out. Most of them were for people who attempted to save other people's lives in swimming or boating accidents, drowning accidents. Most of rural America did not know how to swim back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the Boy Scouts made it a requirement in all of the ranks that you had to do something in swimming. All the way up to Eagle, you had to have swimming merit badge and life-saving merit badge. And that was because nationally it was a disaster. People were dying.
They were dying, yeah. Well, I think that's part of why they had required swim instruction in these camps too, in additional to swimming, you know. And I don't know the history of when the Red Cross started with its life-saving instruction and stuff like that camps started incorporating. But that was important. And even today in inner cities, we find that there are people saying to kids, hey, you need to learn to swim, because they're finding kids in swimming today, especially black kids, not knowing how to swim, and really encouraging that. So things come around. So frequently the camps had inter-camp waterfront activities. So there are pictures of thousands of kids at a lakefront. So hiking was an integral component of activities in camp. And during this time period, the commission and numerous New York organized hiking and walking groups were hiking on old roads throughout the park. Each of these groups had a different idea for building trails in the park. So in 1920, Major Welch brought them together to organize the Palisades Interstate Park Trail Conference. They began to work on the RD, or the Ramapo-Dunderberg Trail, the first trail in the park. And this group ultimately organized or reorganized into the New York-New Jersey Trail Conference, which is still building trails in the park and other places today. It's an organization of hiking clubs. In 1922, Benton McKay created a plan to develop the Appalachian Trail. The trail that we all know goes from Georgia to Maine. And with the help of the New York and New Jersey groups, the very first part of this trail, of the AT, was developed between Bear Mountain and Harriman, going out to 17. So we're the oldest and first part of the trail. And although the Boy Scout organizations participated in these efforts, they wanted their own trail system. And as camps expanded on the lakes of Kanowahke, they needed to venture further and further out to parts of the park to hike, to spend overnights, because they were starting to trip over each other around the Kanowahke lakes. So they developed the Whiteboard trail system. In 1920, under the direction of the chief of camping, Gordon, Archibald Shorey, and Martin Brown of the American Museum of Natural History, the Scouts began building a trail system for the Boy Scouts. They started using foot-long wooden sticks as markers, but people kept taking them. So they had to do something new, and in 1922, Troop 208 of the Bronx expanded the system to be called the Whiteboard Trail. And it spread out and encircled the land surrounding all of the lakes and surrounding all of the caves. They built trails to connect old wood trails for more than 40 miles, although some people say 40 miles and some people say 65 miles. This is the trail system. The markers were red metal discs painted and stenciled with a white bar symbol fastened to trees. The two top are emblems. The bottom is sort of the sign of what the marker looked like in 1922. So leaving from the headquarters, those big buildings, it required 5.5 days to complete the hike. They established 5 rustic campsites as overnight stations, each one a day apart. Each site had a name: Camp Forest Ranger, Leather Stocking, Hawkeyes, Pathfinders, Prairie, and Deer Slayer. Those were the names of these rustic tramps along the Whiteboard Trail. There was a staff person at each station to welcome and feed the hikers. There also might be a guide who will then hike with them, with the group, and show them what they were seeing, explain what they were seeing. And although they circled the lake for 40 or 65 miles, they were really never more than a few hours or 5 miles from headquarters. So there were folks that if they had to get back, they couldn't get back in a few hours. The sites were connected by wireless radio. 30 scouts would go out as a group. And in the rustic shelters, they learned to make and break camps, cook, make firing for activities at night. And special emblems were awarded to scouts who spent 5 nights on the trail. The Brooklyn Borough camps set up a relay race around the trail. So it's not enough to hike for 5 days, but now you have to make a race out of it. So groups of 10 were sent out to see which group was the fastest. The Whiteboard Trail system is no longer there. But there is a Whiteboard Trail, and many of the current trails in the park walk along and cross what was once the system. Now, they didn't have Facebook and they didn't have Twitter, but they had several ways of communicating. Some camps had wireless radios and taught the scouts that. But one of the more publicized programs were the semaphores, which is a system of signaling messages by holding the arms of 2 flags or poles in certain positions according to an alphabetic code. Now, kids in the park learned that, but they didn't just do it, they had to do it acrobatically. So we see in 1911, okay, it started so early. In 1911, the Boy Scout Handbook, we find that to be a scout, to be a second-class scout, the tenderfoot must know elementary signaling by knowing the semaphore, or American Morse, or Meyer alphabet. By the time you were to get a merit badge, you had to signal with a metaphor and send a message of not fewer than 24 letters per minute. So you really had to work your way up to do this. And this would be an example of the alphabet. In 1911 and 1912, the Saturday Evening Post and Boys' Life magazine, and on covers of the Boy Scout handbook, depict scouts with flags. Signaling was alive and well at Lake Kanowahke, as we can see from these pictures. Ernest Thompson Seton's legacy to the Boy Scouts is the extensive nature program. From its early days in Bear Mountain, Harriman, universities and museums served as consultants to help the park renew the land. The Ramapo Mountains were first explored because they had tall, straight trees that Europeans needed for ship masts. Remember, most of the area was mined, and the park was denuded of trees. They needed to reforest and import animals. The American Museum of Natural History had an extensive educational program, which was available to the park in many ways. The most well-known of the consultants from the museum is Benjamin Talbot Babbitt Todd, known as Uncle Benny. And many of you saw the plaque to him today at Lake Kanowahke. Mr. Hyde was a scoutmaster in New York City while working in the Department of Anthropology. He visited the scout camps at Lake Kanowahke, and he realized that not enough of their activities related to nature. He began quietly asking the scouts to help him find things in their environment and encourage their curiosity and powers of observation. They brought him items and their questions. He took all of that material and developed them into a nature museum. He was available to answer questions. A library and a garden was developed. Over the years, other scientists came to help. The camps created several emblems related to the museum work and museum skills, a weekly nature publication called the Camp Naturalist. That beaver came out of Lake Sebago in 1948. It is still sitting in the archives. We used it in an exhibit. So, a weekly nature publication called The Naturalist, that's the only plain picture I had of The Naturalist, or the Kanowahke Naturalist, was published. Uncle Benny was the force behind the Spruce Pond Forestry Camp for older boys. Younger boys who wanted this pioneer experience, so that many of the general camps developed their own special forestry programs. So ultimately, each camp had its own museum. The museums were empty at the beginning of the year, and during each summer, the scouts brought material they found to the museum, where they were prepared, labeled, and made into exhibits. The nature department was overseen by staff from Cornell University. A nature counselor was sectioned to work at every camp. The museum emblem was awarded by, this was the Brooklyn, by museum staff who met, kids who met certain collection requirements. I've only met one person who went to scout camps at Kanowahke. And he was a Boy Scout at one of the camps. I think it may have been Leeming. And to my surprise, he told me he remembered Uncle Benny. Roy Pinney, born in 1911, was in his 90s when I met him. He was a photographer, an author of nature books for children, was a war correspondent, a professional photographer, a herpetologist, live man with all the snakes around, and a journalist. He would have been at Lake Kanowahke in the early 20s when the nature program was beginning. He claimed to owe his interest in nature to the Boy Scout camps and Uncle Benny. He did not learn about nature in Brooklyn when he was growing up in Powell. I can just see him as one of those curious boys who had the opportunity to explore and learn in his environment. But Uncle Benny didn't limit himself to the Boy Scout camps. He purchased a used Model T Ford called the Flying Squirrel, put a variety of critters into the numerous pockets, because he just had his jacket had pockets all over the place, and went visiting other camps in the park. He worked very hard to help campers overcome their fears of animals. He and his staff gave both informal talks and formal talks. There seemed to be a contest between these camps to see which ones learned the most about nature. Uncle Benny and his staff and other people from the museum developed the Trailside Museum and Zoo at Bear Mountain, which continues today to provide nature education. Ernest Seton's reverence for the Native American culture, mostly the culture of Plains Indians and not local Indians, spread throughout the United States in camps. Many of the Kanowahke, New York Boy Scout camps, the camps were named after men in the scouting movement, but age groupings and tents in some camps were named after native tribes, or words and locations. Even when they weren't real words, they were made to sound like Indian words. For some, like Camp Nehawk, which was Camp Cone Backwoods, and some camps upstate. For some, playing Indian represented an attempt to lead a more primitive life rather than the restricted lives they led in the city. At times, though, their information about Native Americans did not come from actual real sources and stressed the savage rather than the environmental nature of Native Americans. They rarely had opportunities to interact with Native Americans, although there were 3 clans of natives just outside the park. They were playing out a culture that either never or no longer existed. On the other hand, many young men found this an opportunity to learn and to respect other cultures. The camp or the council fires was often the place where people put on native costumes and tales were presented. In several of the camps, there were several campfires a week. Each camp unit had their own, which campers sang or performed and did stunts. And the best of the material was then presented at the camp-wide council fire on Saturday nights. At this time, individual and tent awards, badges, and emblems were presented. More native plays and rituals and performances happened at the Kanowahke camps during the inter-camp pageants. Some of you went to Pageant Point today? Okay. Once a summer, all of the Boy Scout camps got together, conducted a pageant, an event consisting of many theatrical performances by campers from all camps. The themes changed. The scenes depicted Last of the Mohegan, Rip Van Winkle, settlement of the American West, Abraham Lincoln, development of scouting, all ending with the West Point Band playing taps. So this event was held at Pageant Point. 4,000 to 6,000 people would attend every year. They invited the world. Okay. People from outside of camps attend. Well, first of all, if you think of all the camps there and all their kids and their families and visitors and people who had come earlier in the summer, they invited people from the outside, and children from other camps would be brought via park omnibuses to Pageant Point from even up to Twin Lakes.
How could they hear?
I don't know. Anybody there? Did anyone go to it? We don't know how they did it.
They didn't have loudspeakers and electricity, right?
The pictures that you see of just thousands of people there. What it would end up being like, I don't know. I keep looking at the pictures and I said, I would leave. Well, the Boy Scouts and the interest in residential camping kept growing. Councils outside of New York City wanted to camp in Harriman. By 1920, there started to be problems. There was no way to totally segregate the camps from the visitors to the park. Picnickers and fishermen wanted to share their sites. The central plumbing plant had difficulties, leading some of the camps to be without water for several hours a day. There was so little space between camps on the lakes, they had to go further and further afield to hike and do woodcraft. And they were leasees. They didn't own the place. It was not their own camp. Several other social agencies with camps in the park, beginning in Harriman, started purchasing their own land and moved out. By 1922, the Boy Scouts began looking for a new site. Franklin Roosevelt, who was president of the Board of Greater New York City Council, established a search committee in 1924. They began looking close to New York, but a large open tract of land and isolated from settled communities was not easy to find within easy distance from New York. It needed an adequate water supply and accessibility to public transportation. The site they liked in Boyd Corners, New York, was too expensive. They found land in Sullivan County, where there were several parcels of land that were for sale. And as often found in real estate dealings, the negotiations for the parcels were kept secret. Owners of the adjacent properties were not to know that it was the Boy Scout Foundation interested in purchasing the land, because they needed several, and if one knew, they could up the price. And so 9,776 acres around the Round Lake near the mouth of 10 Mile River in the town of Tustin was officially purchased in October of 1927. Other tracts of land were purchased in 1930. Development began, and by the summer of 1928, the first Boy Scout camps began slowly moving out of Harriman State Park. By 1930, only one Boy Scout camp, the only Boy Scout camps that were left at Kanowahke were the New Jersey Scouts. But not to worry about the park, though. As soon as the Boy Scouts left, they either brought in new social agencies or other organizations to many of the Boy Scout sites, or they moved existing camps onto these sites. A lot of the Girl Scout camps that were spread all over the place came down. Quinnipiac was way up at Twin Lakes and moved down to K11. Today, there are no Boy Scout or Girl Scout camps in Harriman State Park. There are still camps on two of the Harriman and Kanowahke lakes, but not as many, with spaces between them and a much better water system. I hope you enjoyed this historical trip back to the 1920s at Lake Carr in Kanowahke. The model of New York City Boy Scouts and the Palisades Interstate Park Commission was both expanded to 10 Mile River and to the rest of Harriman State Park. Camping in the United States has changed since then. There may not be as many residential camps, but many more children attend day camps. But they still sing the same songs and do many of the same activities. They are still out in nature and have fun in the park. And I hope you have fun in the park for the rest of the day. Thank you.